I answer to Guy, to Guy, to Chet, to Chet, to Shay.
Great. Good. Well, welcome everyone to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison, who I teach history at Suffolk University and also chair Revolution 250's advisory group. And our guest today is Guy Chet from the University of North Texas. So Professor Chet, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. Thank you.
He was just telling me the many pronunciations of his name, and he'll keep correcting us throughout. And he's written 3 books so far. The first was Conquering the American Wilderness, The Triumph of European Warfare in the Colonial Northeast. And then his second book was The Ocean is a Wilderness, on Atlantic Piracy and the Limits of State Authority. And we're really here to talk about your most recent book, The Colonists American Revolution, Preserving English Liberty, 1607-1783, which is really an interesting take on the American Revolution, as it's really about the idea of Americanization. When did these people become Americans, and were they rebelling because of a sense of American identity or to preserve what they understood as their English liberties? I hope I haven't either misrepresented or given too much away that you were going to say.
No, it's this book is a product of mostly my experience of teaching the American Revolution, and that I noticed that there's something unconvincing about the conventional narrative that we all grow up with from school to grad school about the American Revolution. It's not credible. And this explains why, look, if the explanation of the revolution were settled, we'd stop writing books about it.
Right.
The stream of books about the revolution increases. It's amazing. It increases from decade to decade. Mm-hmm. And we're offering new and hopefully more credible explanations. And I see this, and I've seen this with my students, that the idea that this war broke out over, over taxes and economic regulation, it makes the American response seem hysterical and paranoid and radical, as many historians really do say, but it seems completely disproportional to the offense. And that's just a general dissatisfaction with the conventional explanation. There's also the issue of, if this really is a revolution to change the status quo, then why are the leaders of the revolution the absolute winners of colonial society? Like, why would the rich and powerful want to change the status quo? They like it. They would like it.
Yeah.
And why would they risk their vast wealth and lives and their families' social standing over taxes that they could pay 100 times over?
Mm-hmm.
And
those are good questions.
And why were the people on the bottom, if we're told that there's this class enmity between rich and poor, why would, if the rich are doing it for economic self-interest, then why are the poor doing it?
Mm-hmm.
And all sorts of problems. The Tea Act.
Right. Yeah.
Why would people go to the streets to fight against a tax cut?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So these head scratchers encourage students and scholars to fish around for, like, something's not right here. So maybe there's a hidden motive.
Right.
It explains, so maybe it's class conflict or a land grab out west or white supremacy or slavery or an emerging national identity or anti-Catholicism or anyways. So and I think one of the reasons why we fish around for other explanations is that, again, the response seems hysterical and disproportionate and radical, but we know these people. They don't seem like radicals. They don't seem like hysterics. And so it must be something else. There must be something else. And so what this book offers is an explanation for their resistance and rebellion that makes them seem like normal Englishmen of their day, traditionalists rather than radicals, sober and conservative and proportional rather than paranoid. And it presents them as conventionally English rather than uniquely American. And I hope, what I do in my classes and what I try to do in this book is make the rebels seem more recognizable to us as normal people, and have the students see their complaints as reasonable rather than weird or
Right.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so they are, normal people, but they live in a different time. They have a different frame of reference, different understanding of things, which also is one of the challenges we have as historians, that is making them relatable without simply making them into our contemporaries.
Right. I think one of the so I have in my classes, and I do this. I try to do this in writing at the beginning of the book. There's a challenge with teaching contemporary English speakers about an English-speaking culture from 200 or 300 years ago, because we share a common language, but the meaning of the word, of very important words, is actually quite different. For example, our usage of the term liberty and their usage of the term liberty, these are different things. They're not completely disconnected, but they use them in a very, when they apply them, it was within the understanding of a legal concept of libertas, and kind of, without getting into the detail, but basically the clarification that this is mine and you cannot share in it. Our use of the word liberty is a more general term, a sentiment of freedom.
Right.
When we read them talking about liberty, we think that we understand them, but in fact we don't. The same thing with revolution. We understand our image of a revolution is what we've come to know in modern revolutions as a fundamental and quick and often violent transformation of political institutions and culture and social structures, and basically how we change our system, whether our society or our politics, from A to B. But when they talked about revolution, they talked about a revolution like a wheel or like
revolving of planets.
Revolving, exactly. Okay, so they understood revolution not as going from A to B, but going from A back to A, to basically restoring the way things used to be. Okay, so the term revolution to us suggests radical change or change, whereas to them it meant restoring the old status quo. So we have this barrier because we're English speakers, that we read our modern understanding of certain very important terms, liberalism, etc., into their documents, and it leads us to project modern motives, modern sensibilities to them.
Let me ask, and now I'm not giving anything away when I say that you actually were born in another country and immigrated here and have spent now 30 plus years in the United States. So does that, being an outsider, help you to see this more clearly, or is it a hindrance? And what about some of your students may also be immigrants?
So I thought so. I thought when I came, I was educated in Israel, and I came here for my graduate work. And I did believe that being an outsider meant that I was not susceptible or that I wasn't imbued with the natural kind of local patriotism or just the national myths that Americans grow up with, because I'm an outsider. I didn't absorb these things. And I believed it for many years. But then as time wore on, and I think I became more versed in the literature, in scholarship, I came to realize that actually where does an Israeli or an Israeli teacher, an Israeli professor, or an Israeli textbook writer, where does he get his understanding of American history? My professors in Israel, or my teachers, or my textbook writers in Israel, got their version of American history from American scholars.
Right.
Okay, so and I grew up way over there in Israel with the same understanding that every American grows up with, and that is that Englishmen came here, America transformed them into something else, and that explains why so basically they drifted farther and farther away from their homeland,
Right.
mother country. The end was a break, eventually you just separate like a divorce. But in any case, so it turns out that everywhere, all over the world, depends on American scholarship to understand American history in the same way that you growing up here, what do you know about Israeli history?
Right.
You know about Israeli history what Israeli scholars say about their country, about that country. So it turns out it's no help at all.
Okay. We're talking with Guy Chet, professor of history at the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas. And then also, you also are a student of Roman history, the history of Rome, the Roman Empire, and so on. So I'm wondering how that, and you go back and forth between teaching American history, teaching Roman history, how one informs or challenges the other.
So I think the only relevance, the main thing is that Roman history, my failure at Latin brought me to study American history, because when I was in college, like you said, my interest, my love was Roman history, and much of Roman history is military history simply because so many sources are there. And so I was drawn to Roman military history, and I took Latin, and I was good at it, but it just broke my back. It's more and more work. And after 3 years, I saw that I still didn't, again, and I was a good student, but if I didn't have my tables on one hand and the dictionary on the other hand, and translating word by word by word, I didn't get the line. I didn't have a sense for it. And I just got dispirited, and I realized I will never, this is not a good marriage. And English I knew, and I already loved American history because I spent 2 years as a child in the U.S. and I loved America. So I came over to American history, and the reason why I studied American military history is because my sensibilities or my interests were shaped by my Roman military history classes. So that's the important part. The other relevance is a negative relevance in the sense. Pardon? Can you hear me?
No, I didn't have a question yet. Yeah. Oh. Yes.
Okay. So the other point of relevance is that for many some scholars approach the American Revolution or explain the American Revolution through the prism of political philosophy. And for those scholars, Roman history, Roman Republican history, is very important because they see classical influences on the political thinking of the Americans, and and I've grown increasingly skeptical of that. Or not even skeptical. I deny it, in the sense that there's no doubt that Jefferson and Adams and they were versed in classical history and in political philosophy, but the American Revolution was a mass movement of farmers and innkeepers and dock workers and hundreds of thousands of people who didn't read any classical history, didn't know any political philosophy. Basically, the only book they knew was the Bible and sermons. So, so for that Roman influence or classical influence to trickle down, I'm highly skeptical.
Okay. Well, I mean, a number of other questions, but bringing up the Bible is kind of the root of most Americans' understanding of the world. I wonder how this plays into it. Is there You mentioned you have a piece in your book about the Great Awakening's influence and the Quebec Act, other pieces of the religious story. I'm wondering how all of that, I don't want you to give away too much of the book, which is the Colonists American Revolution, Preserving English Liberty. But is that a bigger piece of the story than we more secular scholars might want to delve into?
Right. So that's another revelation that I had over time. I was, like you said, I grew up, myself secular, but more important, I grew up in academia, which is secular in its mindset and its methods. And I always assumed, especially since the leadership was not particularly devout of the leadership of the revolution, I didn't see religious sentiment as a particularly important feature in this particular event. But as with time and with a greater sensitivity to what these people, again, not the Jeffersons and the George Washingtons, Joe Blows on the street, what informed their political sensibilities, it's Protestantism and the Bible. And so in this respect, if to simplify my understanding of the revolutionary philosophy to a slogan, to a sentence, I would say that what explained Americans their understanding of politics or of society is a very negative understanding of human nature. Again, the slogan I use is that people with power will abuse it.
Right.
And so if they didn't get that understanding from political philosophers in the 18th century or from classical history or from history at all, where did they get it? And I think, again, if you look at the Joe Blows rather than the John Adamses, they got it from church, which Protestantism emphasizes the innate sinfulness and wickedness of human beings, and and as important, from the Old Testament. And this is a thing that, again, I wasn't aware of early on, but became aware of, that the English in England and in America, much more so than other Europeans, were an Old Testament culture rather than, also, of course, they embraced the New Testament, but the Old Testament was a strong presence in the reading materials of Englishmen, more so than continental Europeans.
Interesting.
And the Old Testament, more than the New Testament, offers a chronicle of human wickedness, especially in positions of power.
Right.
And so they heard what they heard theoretically in church, and the one book that they all read as bedtime reading, as writing, as reading and writing lessons, as penmanship lessons, etc., reinforced that. I mean, they knew these characters in the same way that, King Saul and David, like we know our TV characters. And so if you take a guy like King Saul, for example, if you know that story and you know that character, you get it without having to study philosophy or human nature, that King Saul was a bad king, not because he was a bad man. In fact, he was an exceptionally good man, but he became a bad king because of kingship, not because of his nature. And so I think these people, where they get what we would call paranoia, but their suspicion about government, is because of this conviction that people with power will abuse it.
Right.
Therefore, they viewed their governments with great suspicion because of this familiarity with their form of entertainment, which is the Bible.
That's interesting, because my students at least have trouble with Thomas Paine's Common Sense, because he is so critical of the Jewish people in the same way that Samuel was critical of the Jewish people for wanting a king. And my students see this as blatant anti-Semitism, when Paine is tapping into, I don't think they really understand anti-Semitism, but Paine is really tapping into, he knows the mindset of these people and what Americans understand.
Right.
And so he's using these analogies that, as you said, would have been as visible to them as today, talking about Real Housewives would be.
Right. Look, if I just say the word Homer Simpson,
Mhm.
you and okay, maybe I'm a bit
Yeah,
dated, but today's version of Homer Simpson, everyone gets
yeah.
the character,
Mhm.
who this is, and what the lesson we should draw from this
Mhm.
character is.
Yeah,
To them, these characters, and like Tom Paine was hardly religious or devout,
no, yeah,
but this was his world, and this
yeah,
was
oh
his
yeah,
reader's world, and
yeah.
he could convey a political philosophy message. Like
Mhm.
I would say that the Bible does the same thing.
Yeah, oh
It
yeah,
conveys a political philosophy message
yeah,
through stories.
oh
Okay?
yeah.
And so when you wonder, why are they so suspicious? Why are they, I mentioned the Tea Act. Why are they looking at a
Mhm.
tax break with such suspicion and
Yeah,
resentment? Why are they looking at mild tax hikes as forms of tyranny? If you take into consideration that they have in the back of their minds this conviction that people with power will abuse it, then
mhm.
you understand, the fear of every measure of centralization. And
Yeah,
again, it's not a uniquely American position. We saw the same reaction in 2 or 3 or 4 British rebellions in the
mhm.
previous century.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we're talking with Guy Chet from the University of North Texas, author of The Colonists American Revolution. And Jonathan has just put up a quote in our chat that comes from a town meeting in Middleborough, Massachusetts in October of 1774, that it is the very essence of the British Constitution that the people shall not be governed by laws in making of which they had no hand, or have their money taken away from them without their consent, which is neatly putting this complicated story about
Right.
why they are so outraged by these things. It's not necessarily the small amount, but it's the principle.
I try to so again, my students have a hard time believing that people will do such things out of principle. And I quote them there about the Tea Act, that they said that the British, the government, is trying to make us drink our principles with our tea.
Mhm.
And I try to use a contemporary example or scenario to see if to show them that we are not that different from them.
Mhm.
And I say, if you in Denton, the town I teach in, you accept that the city of Denton can tax you,
Mhm.
okay? And the state of Texas can tax you, and the government of the United States can tax you, okay? But if all of a sudden the neighboring city will say, we're imposing a tax on you here in Denton,
Mhm. Mhm.
you would say, what the heck? And you're not going to pay it, and you're going to
Right.
go to court and everything else, even though it's only $1 or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, but so I asked them, why would they resist it in the way that they won't resist the other taxes?
Mhm.
And they point out that again, that we believe in in representative government, and that
Mhm.
I need
Yeah.
to consent to my own taxes. And I said, look, it's the same thing. No taxation without
Yeah.
representation is a really important thing to you. You believe in government by consent, and you'd
Mhm.
go to, I don't know if you'd go to war, but you'd fight over this principle,
Yeah.
even if the money was minuscule.
Right.
And so you're not that different from them, except in the sense that you can recognize now that they weren't hysterical, but they were really principled
Right.
and quite admirable.
Yeah. Yeah. We're talking with Guy Chet from the University of North Texas. Now, an author of The Colonists American Revolution. Now, one of the really big things you do in the book is show that Americanization wasn't, they weren't rebelling because they had become Americans. So let me ask, but you recognize, you've written essays about how America is different. I mean, it's the culture they may be permeating the world. But if it doesn't begin in the revolution, or it's not accomplished by the revolution, when does all of that happen? I realize we're both scholars of the earlier period, so I wonder, what your thoughts are on when Americanization does happen.
Right. So first, Americanization, of course, happens all the time. So I mean, from the very beginning, I explain to my students, I explain in the book that Americanization is an anthropological concept, and it makes a lot of sense that the environment shapes the culture. Okay? So if you take a hill people and relocate them to the valley, or vice versa, you expect after a generation or two that the culture will change because the setting, the environment, the economy has changed. Family structure will change. And so along the same lines, when you move English people from a place that doesn't have vast territories and doesn't have American Indians and doesn't have a different climate and doesn't have slavery and doesn't have a strong presence of Africans and a mix of religions, everything that's unique about America, of course, the environment will shape the culture. But I point out to them that when you take those people from the valley and move them to the hills, you'll also see that they will change the environment to fit their culture. Okay, so they will cut into the mountains to create fields, flat fields, to allow their kind of agriculture that they're used to. So while environment shapes culture, culture also shapes environment. I mean, just look around how we've reshaped our environment. You can see that, again, my students are in Texas, and so I point out to them the lawns in their front yards. Okay, this is not a Texan thing. It's a Midwestern thing.
Right.
But when Midwesterners came to the South, they wanted lawns. And so they reshaped the environment, they created irrigation. And so, so Americanization and Anglicization happened all the time, at the same time. The debate really is which is stronger, which was the more powerful force. And to my mind, Anglicization was much more noticeable in that if you dropped an Englishman in America in 1650 versus in 1750, in 1750, this world, this American society, was much more similar to the English society on the other side of the ocean, in terms of family structure, political structures, just the look of things. And so to me, all the unique things that we identify in America over time, we have our quirky political system and our different sports and different manners, etc. To me, most of that is a product of the American of the political separation and economic separation from England. It's a product of the revolution. It's not a cause for the revolution.
Right. Okay. Interesting. We're talking with Guy Chet from the University of North Texas, and you've also written about Benjamin Church, who is one of the characters we know well for. It turns out he's playing both sides. So, what drew you to a character like Church? You do an essay in the Historical Journal of Massachusetts on Church and his military exploits.
So Church was my first book. Again, this is that military history of colonial America that I wrote first. It was my doctoral dissertation. There are two figures. So it deals with with this. This is how I came to this whole understanding about Americanization. Okay? At the time I didn't realize that there's this big debate about Americanization and Anglicization. I was just writing a military history of colonial America, and in that field, the Americanization storyline is very prominent. Okay? That Americans or the settlers came in with their English or European way of war, and they found that in America that's impractical, it's ill-suited to the conditions, and therefore they developed an American way of war.
Right.
And again, I was fully on board with that understanding. And Benjamin Church and Robert Rogers are the two kind of signature figures for that Americanization
Right.
of military tactics. And eventually, as I was doing the research, I came to the opposite position. I could see that American military establishments did not transform their way of fighting, and that realization that Americans were actually fighting in the conventional European way of war, and for good reason. I show that
Right.
the European way of war was in fact quite successful, even in the American terrain, even against American Indians and their tactics, which turns out I learned was not that unique a challenge for European military establishments. But so military church, Benjamin Church and Robert Rogers, for me to make my case credibly, I had to. So when I started working on them, it was to show their innovation, because originally I was promoting the Americanization storyline.
Sure.
But as during the writing of the book, as I was convinced of the opposite, as the findings led me to the other direction, I could see that the story of Benjamin Church as the key figure for understanding the American victory or the English victory in King Philip's War is actually the people at the time during King Philip's War did not see Benjamin Church as a key figure in the story of the war. Yeah. Contemporary histories of the war did not highlight or did not even mention him. But in the 19th century, 19th and 20th century, he became the face of King Philip's War. And so again, it's another indication that the Americanization storyline is not one that the English colonists had, but one that modern Americans developed. And again, that's why in the Revolutionary book, that's what I tried to convey in the title, The Colonists American Revolution, that I'm trying to show the readers, like I show my students.
Right.
I'm trying to follow the lead of the colonists rather than historian. As I was saying it, I'm stopping myself. I'm a historian too, but it's a real methodological or philosophical question. Who is a more credible guide to a historical event? In this case, the revolution. The revolutionary American at the time, or the American historian 250 years later, and there are good arguments on both sides. I mean, we the historians do know more than they do, more than they did.
Yeah.
We have more data. We can integrate data. We know the trends, which they didn't. But they know a lot of things that we don't know. So it's there's a case to be made that we should listen to historians and discount the eyewitnesses. But there's also a case to be made to listen to the eyewitnesses and discount a little bit the historians. And that's what I try to do in the book.
Right. One of the many things I really like about your book is it does approach this with looking for interpretation, looking for understanding. And you have actually questions at the end of the chapters, which I know are useful when you're teaching, to have questions for the students. And so I'm going to ask a couple. I think we have time maybe for one. So when did the revolution end and who won? You ask that in the book. And I'm presuming the student will be able to answer that from the book. But what do you think?
So again, the two understandings, the two camps, Americanization, Anglicization, depend on different chronologies of the revolution. This is the question of when did it end?
Right.
So for people who are Americanizationists, to them, the revolution started in 1607. The moment English people came here, America started working on them and transforming them into something else. And eventually, as they became more and more different, the revolution happened. And the end of the revolution, so it started very early and it ended very late,
Mhm.
in 1787 or 1788 or 1789 with a new constitution that set up a new nation state for a new people.
Yeah.
So again, it completes this story of transformation. They were this, they became this, they were separated, and then they enshrined this differentness in a new form of government.
Right.
For Anglicizationists like myself, the revolution started very late. It started in the 1760s, and it ended as soon as the last shot was fired in the war. So in 1783, the revolution was over, and so it's so for the Americanizationists, the American Revolution is a story of change.
Right.
And here you have a change, palpable, very visible in the federal Constitution, which does create something brand new that's never existed before. By contrast, for Anglicizationists, the American Revolution is a story of status quo, again, of revolution, going back to the beginning, and it ends in 1783 with the first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, which basically recreates the imperial system of government of very strong, independent, sovereign, local state governments, colonial governments, what used to be, and a very weak and receding central government. First in the British Empire, British government, now in the American government. And so these are two different ways of telling the story. One has they have different chronologies because they tell a different story, one of change and one of status quo. And do we have time for the second question?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Who won the war? That's a really interesting, I love working on this with my students or discussing this with them, because they all come into the class already knowing that to understand the American victory, military victory in the war, what we have to study is the National Army. And it's common sense. Of course, you look at the National Army and discount these ragtag militias and because it's small, ragtag. It's not a real army. You can't win a war without a real army.
Right.
And I point out to them that during the revolution, or immediately after the revolution, Americans actually during the revolution as well, Americans clarified in a variety of ways that they believed that it's the militias who won the American Revolution.
Right.
Okay? Not the National Army, not the Continental Army. And and of course my students understand it, again, going back to the question of who is more credible, the historical actor himself or the historian many years later. And I asked them, look, you, my students today, happen to have a front row seat to the Afghanistan war. Who won that war? A bunch of ragtag militias, with AK-47s, et cetera, et cetera. Now, maybe 250 years from now, if Afghanistan becomes a real country with a real army and a real national government and national culture, they will point to the fact that, hey, we also had a national army. Okay? We also had a national organization that was taking part in this. And they will tell the story of the Afghan victory very differently. Okay? But, so it's a way of showing them that, hey, again, this debate about who's more credible, but also that the way we tell history often, I would say lamentably, but naturally, the reflection of the kind of country we are. At the time, again, in the 1780s, 1790s, early 1800s, the United States was a states' rights republic. And so their understanding of their founding was that the states, their state military organizations, won the war.
Right.
We, by contrast, in the late 19th century and 20th century, are a nation state, a very centralized nation state.
Yeah.
And so we tell the story with the nation, the national army, the national government as the central
Yes.
player in the victory, in the
Right.
founding.
And you can even see this breakdown. Hamilton, who was a proponent of centralized power and a national army, said the militia were terrible. They were a detriment. So you see that argument happening even then, not based on, let's look at the historical record and understand this, but for a political reason that this is what we want to become, or this is what polity we want.
Yeah. And I just want to for the viewers to clarify that when you say political reason, it's not, I don't think, at least, I don't think it's mendacious.
No.
It's a sincere understanding of bureaucracies. In this case, basically Hamilton's understanding of what's an efficient bureaucracy was the same whether he was talking about a civil bureaucracy or a military bureaucracy.
Right.
And so he saw atomization as inefficient, which is a mindset that we modern people share, rightly or wrongly, doesn't matter. And therefore, he looked at the war, he was predisposed to discounting the activities and contributions of these small local organizations, and he was attentive to the contribution of the central organization. Whereas most Americans of his day had the opposite understanding of bureaucracies in general, and therefore the war too.
Right. Thank you. We've been talking with Guy Chet. We probably could go on for another hour or two, but I know you have tornadoes to watch and other things to do.
I only have another hour. So.
Okay, good. So I want to thank you for joining us, guys. This has been really interesting, fun to talk to you, and I hope we can have you on again to work through a lot of these problems and these issues. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, who is our producer and arranges this. And I also want to thank our many listeners. Initially we thought we'd have a handful of folks around Boston tuning in, but we have pretty regular listeners. So this week I want to thank our listeners in Moyock, North Carolina, and in Las Vegas and North Las Vegas, and Banglamung and Chonburi in Thailand, and Neptune City and Newark, both in the Garden State, A Coruña in the lovely Galicia region of Spain, and in Pensacola, Florida, all places in between. Thank you all for tuning in, and now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.